In the frozen wilderness of 1867 Montana Territory, a desperate half-Chinese woman approaches a lonely bachelor's cabin with nothing but 3 whispered promises. I can cook, I can clean, I can be quiet. When Daniel Morrison opens his door to the trembling stranger, he has no idea that letting Margaret Chen into his home will transform them both. But will their newfound sanctuary survive when vengeful men from town come hunting for blood? Margaret's fingers turned blue as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, her breath coming out in white puffs that disappeared into the gray December sky. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly around her like a frozen ocean, and she hadn't eaten anything but snow for 2 days. Her stomach made angry, growling sounds that echoed in the empty wilderness. Behind her, 3 miles down the mountain, the small mining town of Cedar Falls buzzed with the same hateful whispers that had followed her from place to place. That Chinese girl, they called her, though her mother had been as Irish as spring rain. Unnatural, they said, doesn't belong here. The hotel owner's wife had thrown Margaret's few belongings into the street that morning, screaming about how her kind made decent folks uncomfortable. The wind bit at her face like angry teeth, and Margaret pulled her thin coat tighter. It didn't help much. The coat had belonged to her mother, and it was falling apart at the seams. Everything Margaret owned was falling apart: her shoes, her hope, her belief that somewhere in this vast country, someone might see her as more than just different. Ahead, smoke rose from a cabin chimney, like a gray ribbon pointing toward heaven. Margaret's heart jumped. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant warmth. Warmth meant someone lived there. Someone who might need help with cooking or cleaning. Someone who might let her stay alive another day. She practiced her words as she walked. The same words she'd used at every door for the past month. I can cook, sir. I can clean. I can be quiet. The last part was the most important. Everyone wanted her to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, to pretend she barely existed. The cabin grew larger as she approached, and Margaret could see it was built strong, from thick logs that would keep out the worst of winter's bite. A single horse stood in a small shelter beside the house, its breath steaming in the cold air. That meant one person lived here, probably a man, probably alone. Alone might mean desperate enough to hire someone like her. Margaret stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared at the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was her 4th try today. The first 3 had ended with doors slammed in her face and harsh words about staying with her own kind. But what was her own kind? Her Chinese father had died when she was 7. Her Irish mother had died 3 years ago. Margaret belonged nowhere and to no one. The cabin door was made of thick wood, painted green but faded by sun and weather. A window beside it glowed with warm yellow light from inside. Margaret could see the shadow of a person moving around, probably cooking dinner. Her mouth watered at the thought of hot food. She raised her hand to knock, then froze. What if this man was like all the others? What if he took one look at her face and saw only what they all saw, something foreign and unwelcome? But the cold was seeping through her worn-out boots, and her toes were going numb. She had nowhere else to go. Before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open. You planning to stand there all night? Or do you have business with me? Margaret jumped backward, her heart leaping into her throat. The man in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had streaks of silver, even though he didn't look much older than 35. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they studied her with curiosity rather than anger. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to bother you. Margaret's words tumbled out fast and nervous. I was wondering if you might need help with your house. I can cook good meals, keep things clean, mend clothes that are torn. She took a deep breath. And I can be very quiet. The man leaned against the doorframe, still looking at her with those gray eyes. You running from something? The question hit Margaret like a slap. She wasn't running from anything, she was running to something. To work, to a warm place to sleep, to the chance to prove she was worth more than people thought. No, sir. I'm looking for work. An honest day's work, for an honest day's pay. She lifted her chin, trying to look braver than she felt. I don't cause trouble, and I don't ask for much. The man stepped back from the doorway, and warm air rushed out to wrap around Margaret like a hug. Name's Daniel Morrison. This is my place. He gestured toward the inside of the cabin. You got a name? Margaret Chen. She watched his face carefully, waiting for his expression to change when he heard her last name. Most people's faces got tight and unfriendly when they realized she was part Chinese. Daniel nodded once. Chinese. Half, Margaret said quickly. My mother was Irish, green eyes and red hair, born in County Cork. She always mentioned her mother when people figured out her heritage. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. Doesn't matter to me what you are, as long as you can do what you say you can do. Daniel opened the door wider. Come in before you turn into an ice sculpture. We can talk about work by the fire. Margaret's legs almost gave out with relief. He was letting her inside. He was willing to talk about work. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. As she stepped over the threshold, she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope she'd learned not to hope too quickly, but maybe the possibility of hope. The cabin smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something else she couldn't identify. Something that felt like safety. Behind her, the wind picked up and rattled the windows, reminding her of the cold world outside. But for the first time in weeks, Margaret was warm. The inside of Daniel Morrison's cabin surprised Margaret in ways both good and concerning. The main room was larger than it had looked from outside, with a stone fireplace that threw dancing light across furniture that was clearly made by skilled hands. Bookshelves lined one wall from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than Margaret had ever seen in one place. But everything was covered in dust, and the whole place had the feel of a house where no woman had lived for a very long time. Sit down, Daniel said, pointing to a chair near the fire. You look like you're about to fall over. Margaret perched on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tight in her lap. The warmth from the fire felt like heaven on her frozen face, but she didn't let herself relax. Not yet. Too many times she'd thought she was safe, only to be thrown out when people changed their minds. Daniel walked to the kitchen area, which was really just one corner of the big room. Margaret could see why he might need help. Dirty dishes were piled in a wash basin. A coffee pot sat on the stove with what looked like yesterday's coffee still in it. Clothes hung on pegs near the door, clean but wrinkled from being folded wrong. Coffee? Daniel asked, holding up a tin cup. Yes, please, Margaret's voice came out, as barely more than a whisper. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was hot and wet, and that was enough. So tell me about this work arrangement you're thinking about, Daniel said, settling into the chair across from her. What exactly are you offering to do? Margaret had given this speech so many times, she could say it in her sleep. I'll cook 3 meals a day, keep your house clean and organized, wash and mend your clothes, tend your garden in spring and summer, preserve food for winter, and handle any other household tasks you need done. I work hard, I don't complain, and I don't get in the way. And what do you want in return? A place to sleep, meals to eat, and whatever wages you think are fair. Margaret paused, then added, I'm not asking for much, just enough to get by. Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at her over his coffee cup. You married? No, sir. Got family somewhere? None living. The words still hurt to say, even though her mother had been dead for 3 years now. What happened to your last job? This was always the hardest question. Margaret could lie, but lies had a way of catching up with you. She decided to tell the truth and see what happened. The hotel owner's wife decided my appearance made her guests uncomfortable. Before that, the merchant's family said the same thing. And before that, she shrugged, letting the gesture finish the sentence. Daniel got up and walked to the window. Outside, snow was falling harder now, and the wind was making the trees bend and sway. This isn't an easy life up here, he said without turning around. Winters are long and brutal. The nearest neighbors are 5 miles down the mountain, and sometimes we don't see another soul for weeks. You sure you can handle being this isolated? I prefer quiet, Margaret said honestly. Crowds make me nervous. Daniel turned back to her, and something in his face had softened. I'll make you a deal. We'll try this arrangement for 1 week. If it works for both of us, we'll make it permanent. Fair wages, decent room, and respect for your privacy. But I have one condition. Margaret's stomach clenched. There was always a condition, and it was usually something that made her want to run. What's that, sir? Whatever brought you up this mountain. Whatever you're running from or toward, that's your business. I won't ask questions you don't want to answer. But while you're under my roof, you're safe. Nobody comes looking for trouble here without getting more than they bargained for. The unexpected kindness in his words made Margaret's throat feel tight. When was the last time someone had offered to protect her, instead of asking what she could do for them? Thank you, sir. She could barely get the words out. Don't thank me yet, Daniel said, with a slight smile that transformed his whole face. Wait until you see the state of this place in daylight. You might change your mind about staying. But Margaret was already looking around the cabin with new eyes, seeing not the dust and disorder, but the possibilities. The beautiful wooden furniture that just needed polish. The books that could be organized and cared for. The kitchen that could be turned into a place where wonderful meals were born. The whole house that could become warm and welcoming instead of just functional. Where would I sleep? She asked. There's a small room off the kitchen. It's got a bed, a chest for your clothes, and a window that looks out toward the mountains. It's not fancy, but it's private and warm. It sounds perfect. And it did. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd had her own room, her own space, where she could close the door and just exist without worrying about taking up too much room in the world. Daniel stood up and walked to a cabinet, pulling out blankets that smelled like cedar and sunshine. You look exhausted. Why don't you get some rest? Tomorrow we can figure out how this is going to work. As Margaret followed him to the small room that might become hers, she caught sight of her reflection in the dark window. Her black hair was tangled from the wind, her clothes were wrinkled from travel, and her face was pale with cold and hunger. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. But in Daniel Morrison's eyes, she'd seen something different. She'd seen someone who looked at her and saw not just her Chinese features or her worn-out clothes, but someone who might be worth taking a chance on. For the first time in months, Margaret Chen allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stop running. Margaret's fingers trembled as she untied her worn cloth bundle. The only belongings she owned spread across Daniel's kitchen table, like secrets finally coming to light. A cracked hand mirror that had been her mother's, 2 faded dresses, a small wooden box containing dried herbs, and a leather-bound journal filled with recipes written in careful script. These herbs, Daniel said, picking up a small pouch and sniffing it, smells like something my grandmother used for healing. Ginger root and willow bark, Margaret replied, watching his face for signs of disgust or suspicion. My mother taught me before she died, said a woman should know how to heal as well as cook. The cabin felt smaller now, with her possessions scattered about, as if her presence was expanding to fill spaces that had been empty for too long. Daniel moved around the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers, showing her where things belonged. His movements were careful, respectful, like he understood that even the smallest gesture could make her feel welcome or unwanted. This was my parents' place, he said, running his hand along the rough wooden counter. Built it themselves when they first came west. Ma died of fever 5 years back. Pa followed her the next winter. Haven't had much use for keeping it nice since then. Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of loss that hung in his words. She'd carried similar ghosts since her own parents died, leaving her to navigate a world that seemed designed to reject people like her. The sleeping arrangements, Daniel continued, his cheeks reddening slightly. There's a small room off the back. Used to be my sister's before she married and moved to California. It's got a good bed, warm quilts, and a window that looks out on the mountains. Complete privacy. Thank you, Margaret said, relief flooding through her. She'd worried about this moment, about what a man alone on a mountain might expect from a woman with nowhere else to go. "We'll eat together," Daniel said firmly. "None of this servants eating in the kitchen business. You're keeping house, not working as hired help. There's a difference." Margaret felt something tight in her chest loosen. Most people don't see it that way. Most people are fools. Daniel picked up her journal and held it out to her. "What kind of recipes you got in here?" "Everything I learned from watching hotel cooks. Plus, what my mother taught me about Chinese cooking. Some Irish stews and breads from her side, too." Margaret opened the journal. Pages filled with neat handwriting and small sketches of plants and cooking methods. "I can make food stretch when money's tight, or dress it up fancy when needed." Daniel leaned closer to look at the pages, and Margaret caught the scent of pine soap and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. "This drawing here. What's this dish?" "Dumplings filled with meat and vegetables. Take a long time to make, but they're filling and taste like heaven when you're hungry." She turned the page, showing more sketches. "This one's a soup that can cure almost any sickness. And this bread recipe? It stays fresh for days, even in cold weather." "You drew all these pictures yourself?" Margaret nodded, suddenly shy. "Helps me remember the exact way things should look." "You're an artist." Daniel's voice held wonder, as if he'd discovered something precious. "These drawings are beautiful. They're just cooking notes," Margaret protested, but warmth spread through her chest at his words. "No, they're more than that. They show you care about what you're doing, about making things right." Daniel closed the journal carefully and handed it back to her. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal that wasn't beans from a can in over a year. Think you can work some magic with what I've got in storage?" Margaret walked to his pantry, taking inventory of the supplies. Flour, salt, dried beans, some preserved meat, and root vegetables stored in boxes of sand to keep them fresh through winter. Not much to work with, but she'd made meals from less. "I can have something special ready by tonight," she said, already planning the meal in her mind. "But first, let me tackle this kitchen properly." Daniel laughed, a sound that seemed rusty from lack of use. "It's pretty rough, isn't it? I've seen worse." Margaret rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were thin but strong from years of hard work. "But it's got good bones. Just needs someone to love it back to life." As she began organizing the kitchen, Daniel settled at the table with a cup of coffee, watching her work. She moved with quiet efficiency, washing dishes that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed, arranging items where they'd be most useful. "You don't have to watch me work," Margaret said, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm not watching you work. I'm watching my kitchen come alive again." Daniel's voice was soft, thoughtful. "Feels like the house is waking up after a long sleep." Margaret paused in her scrubbing, struck by the poetry in his words. "You talk like someone who reads books." "Guilty as charged. Ma made sure I learned my letters. Said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." Daniel gestured toward the shelves of books. "Those are my treasures. Poetry, history, stories from all over the world. You're welcome to read any of them." "I can read," Margaret said quietly. "Both English and some Chinese characters my father taught me. But I've never owned a book of my own." "Well, now you've got access to a whole library." Daniel stood and pulled a slim volume from the shelf. "This one's about a woman who disguises herself as a man to fight in a war. Thought you might like it. She's got your kind of courage." Margaret accepted the book with careful hands, running her fingers over the cover. "You think I'm brave? Walking up to a stranger's cabin in a snowstorm, asking for work when you could have just kept walking? That's not just brave. That's the kind of strength most people never find." Daniel met her eyes. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The afternoon passed quickly as Margaret transformed the kitchen, and with it, the entire feeling of the cabin. She hummed softly as she worked, old Irish songs her mother had sung, and the sound seemed to chase away years of silence and loneliness that had settled into the walls like dust. When evening came, The smell of fresh bread and rabbit stew filled the air, rich and warming. Daniel sat across from her at the table, and Margaret watched his face as he tasted her cooking. His eyes closed, and for a moment, he looked like a man receiving a blessing. "Lord, have mercy," he breathed. "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." Margaret smiled, feeling useful and valued in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Tomorrow I'll make those dumplings, if you can spare some of that preserved meat." "You can have anything in this house," Daniel said, and Margaret believed he meant it. As they cleaned dishes together, working in comfortable silence, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the warm hope of belonging somewhere, of being wanted for who she was, rather than tolerated for what she could provide. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two lonely people were discovering that sometimes family isn't about blood. Sometimes it's about choice and the courage to open your door when someone needs shelter from the storm. The first test came 3 days later when Margaret discovered Daniel burning with fever, his forehead hot enough to fry an egg, and his whole body shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. She'd awakened before dawn to start breakfast, only to find his bed empty, and Daniel collapsed on the kitchen floor, mumbling words that made no sense. "Daniel!" She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her palm against his burning skin. His eyes were open but unfocused, looking right through her like she was made of glass. "Can you hear me?" He tried to speak but only managed a harsh whisper about wolves at the door and his mother calling his name. Margaret had seen fever sickness before. It could steal a person's mind for days, and sometimes they never found their way back. Working quickly, she dragged him to his bed, surprised by her own strength, when fear gave her power she didn't know she possessed. His body felt like a furnace, burning up from the inside, and she knew she had precious little time to bring the fever down before it cooked his brain like meat in a pot. "Stay with me, Daniel Morrison," she commanded, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her chest. "You don't get to die on my watch." Margaret flew into action, grinding willow bark into powder, while water heated on the stove. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, teaching her the old ways of healing that doctors in their fancy suits often ignored. Fever was fire, and fire needed water to quench it. But not just any water, medicine water, blessed with the right herbs and prepared with careful hands. She stripped him to his underclothes, ignoring the red flush that crept up her neck at seeing a man so undressed. Modesty was a luxury she couldn't afford when someone's life hung in the balance. Using cool cloths, she bathed his burning skin, changing the rags as fast as they heated up against his fever. "Drink this," she whispered, lifting his head to press a cup of willow bark tea against his lips. Most of it ran down his chin, but she persisted, getting small sips into him, between his confused mumblings about winter storms and lost cattle. Hour after hour, Margaret fought the fever like a warrior battling an invisible enemy. She spooned broth into his mouth, changed his sweaty bedding, and kept cool cloths on his forehead while he thrashed and muttered. Her back ached from bending over him. Her hands were raw from wringing out cloths in cold water, but she never left his side. "Please don't die," she whispered, during the long hours when his breathing grew shallow and his skin burned even hotter. "I finally found a place where I belong. Don't make me lose it now." By the second night, exhaustion weighed on Margaret like a heavy coat she couldn't remove. She dozed in the chair beside his bed, startling awake every time he groaned or moved. During one of these moments, she found his fever-bright eyes, looking at her with something that might have been recognition. "Angel," he whispered, his voice like sandpaper on wood. "Just Margaret," she replied, offering him more tea. "The stubborn woman who won't let you die." "Why?" The word came out cracked and barely audible. "Because someone finally saw me as worth protecting," Margaret said, smoothing the damp hair back from his forehead. "Seems only fair I return the favor." The fever broke on the third morning, like a storm cloud finally releasing its rain. Margaret awoke to find Daniel's skin cool and dry, his breathing deep and natural. She pressed her hand against his forehead and nearly cried with relief at the normal temperature she found there. "Margaret?" His voice was weak but clear. His eyes focused on her face with perfect awareness. "Right here." She helped him sit up, supporting his weight as he swayed with weakness. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of wild horses." Daniel looked around the room, taking in the basin of water, the pile of used cloths, the chair pulled close to his bedside. "How long was I sick?" 3 days. You had a fever that could have melted snow." Margaret busied herself straightening the room, suddenly shy now that the crisis had passed. "I wasn't sure you were going to make it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching her fold clean cloths with precise movements. "You could have left. Where would I go? There's 3 feet of snow outside, and the nearest town is miles away." "That's not why you stayed." His voice held certainty that made her hand still on the fabric she was folding. Margaret turned to face him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "No, that's not why I stayed." "Why then?" "Because." She searched for words that could explain the feeling that had driven her to fight so hard for his life. "Because in 3 days, you showed me more kindness than most people show in a lifetime. Because you looked at me and saw Margaret Chen, not just another unwanted person taking up space. Because letting you die would have been like losing the first real home I've ever had." Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers still weak but warm against her palm. "I've been alone on this mountain for 5 years, telling myself I didn't need anyone, that solitude was better than risking disappointment. Then you showed up in that snowstorm, and suddenly my house felt like a home again." "I'm glad I knocked on your door," Margaret said softly. "I'm glad I opened it." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "But now I'm wondering if what we have here is more than just a work arrangement." Before Margaret could answer, the sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Through the window, she could see riders coming up the mountain trail, their faces hard with purpose that didn't look friendly. "Trouble," Daniel said, struggling to sit up straighter. Margaret felt the peaceful bubble of their recovery moment pop like a soap bubble. "Stay in bed. You're too weak to face whatever's coming." "Like hell I am." Daniel swung his legs over the edge of the bed, swaying as weakness hit him. "This is my land, my responsibility." "It's our land now," Margaret said firmly, helping steady him as he stood. "And I won't let anyone hurt what we've built here." Outside, the voices of the approaching men grew louder, and Margaret recognized the tone of people who'd come looking for trouble. She'd heard that sound before, in other towns, from other men who decided she didn't belong. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't running. The crack of breaking twigs snapped Margaret awake before dawn. 4 dark shapes moved through the gray morning mist, like wolves hunting prey. Her heart jumped into her throat as she pressed herself against the cold kitchen window, watching the strangers ride closer to their peaceful cabin. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking like autumn leaves. "Someone's coming." He rolled out of bed faster than lightning, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. The weapon gleamed in the dim light as he checked it carefully. "Stay hidden," he said, his voice hard as mountain stone. "No matter what happens, don't show yourself." The lead rider looked mean and dirty, with a beard that hung like old rope and clothes covered in mud. His name was Jake Hollister, and everyone in town knew he caused trouble wherever he went. Behind him rode 3 other men, all looking hungry for a fight. "Morrison!" Hollister shouted from his horse, his voice carrying across the snow like a threat. "We know you got yourself a visitor up here." Daniel stepped onto the wooden porch, holding his rifle ready, but not pointing it yet. The morning air was so cold it turned his breath into small white clouds. "My business stays my business, Jake," he called back. "What brings you all the way up my mountain?" Margaret crept closer to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She could feel danger in the air, like the smell before a storm. These men hadn't ridden all this way just to talk. "Folks in town are mighty curious about your new helper," Hollister said, spitting tobacco juice into the clean white snow. Some say there's a Chinese girl hiding up here. Some say she stole things before she ran away." The words hit Margaret like a slap across the face. She had never stolen anything in her whole life, not even when she was starving and had no money for food. But she knew how easily lies could spread through a small town, especially about someone who looked different. "You heard wrong," Daniel replied, his voice steady as bedrock. "Nobody's hiding here. Just me and my housekeeper, who earns every penny I pay her." Hollister swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. His 3 friends followed, spreading out like they were getting ready for battle. "Well now, I think we should take a look for ourselves. Make sure this Chinese girl ain't got anything that belongs to other folks." "I think you should climb back on those horses and ride away," Daniel said, shifting his weight slightly. Margaret could see the muscles in his shoulders getting tight, like a cat ready to pounce before someone gets hurt. Margaret watched from behind the curtain as the 4 men moved closer to the porch. Daniel was brave and strong, but 4 against 1 wasn't fair odds. Her stomach twisted with fear, not for herself, but for the kind man who was protecting her. "You're helping a thief, Morrison," Hollister said, taking another step forward. "That makes you just as guilty as she is." "I'm protecting an innocent woman from men who don't know the truth," Daniel answered, his finger moving to the trigger of his rifle. "And from men who have no right to be on my land." The morning sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like thousands of tiny diamonds. But the beauty of the day couldn't hide the ugliness of what was happening. Margaret could feel the situation getting more dangerous by the minute. "Stand aside," Hollister demanded, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "We just want to search your cabin. Make sure nothing's missing from town." "You got a paper from the sheriff saying you can search my place?" Daniel asked. Hollister laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was mean and cold, like ice cracking. "Don't need no paper to catch thieves." "Then you don't need to be here," Daniel said, raising his rifle a little higher. "This is the last time I'm asking you nicely to leave." Margaret could see sweat on Daniel's forehead despite the cold air. His hands stayed steady on the rifle, but she knew he was thinking about what would happen next. 1 man with 1 gun against 4 men who wanted trouble. The silence stretched out like a tightrope ready to snap. Margaret held her breath, knowing that in just a few seconds, someone was going to do something that couldn't be taken back. She had seen violence before, in the cities where she'd tried to find work. She knew how quickly talking could turn into fighting, and fighting could turn into something much worse. Hollister's hand moved closer to his gun. His friends spread out wider, trying to surround the porch. Daniel's jaw got tighter, and Margaret could see him getting ready to fight for his home and for her. That's when she made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Margaret opened the front door and stepped outside. "I'm right here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And I haven't stolen anything from anyone." All 5 men turned to stare at her. She felt their eyes like heavy weights, judging her face, her clothes, everything about her that was different. But for the first time in her life, she didn't look down at the ground. Instead, she kept her chin up and walked toward them with steady steps. "You want to search me? You want to look through my things?" she continued, stopping just far enough away that they couldn't grab her. "Go ahead and try. But you'll do it right here, where Mr. Morrison can see, and when you don't find anything, you'll leave this place and never come back." "Well, well," Hollister said, a mean smile spreading across his dirty face. "The little thief decides to show herself." Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her, but she put her hand out slightly to let him know she was okay. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a bird trying to escape from a cage, but her voice stayed calm. "I'm no thief, but I'm willing to prove it if that's what it takes to end this." "Smart girl," one of the other men said, but his tone made the words sound nasty instead of kind. "Watch your mouth, Pete," Daniel warned, his rifle still ready to fire. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and slowly pulled out everything she owned. First came a small cloth bag that held 3 coins, all the money she had in the world. The coins caught the morning sunlight as she held them up for everyone to see. "This is my money," she said clearly, "earned from honest work." Next, she pulled out a small knife with a wooden handle, worn smooth from years of use. "This was my father's. He used it to carve wood when I was little." Finally, she took out a letter so old and soft it felt like fabric in her hands. "This is the last letter my mother wrote before she died. It's the only thing I have left of her." She held all 3 items up, turning them so every man could see. "This is everything I own, except for the clothes I'm wearing and the pride I won't let you take from me." Hollister looked uncomfortable for the first time since he'd arrived. He had expected to find stolen goods, maybe jewelry, or money that didn't belong to her. Instead, he saw the simple belongings of someone who had very little, but had earned it honestly. "That's it?" asked Pete, sounding disappointed. "That's everything," Margaret replied. 3 coins, a knife, and a memory. Not much to show for 23 years of life, but it's all mine. The morning air felt thick with tension. Margaret could hear birds singing in the pine trees, unaware of the human drama playing out below their branches. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed, reminding her that it was Sunday morning and other people were getting ready for peaceful worship. "Mrs. Pemberton at the hotel says a silver locket went missing," Hollister said. But his voice didn't sound as sure as before. "Worth a lot of money. She thinks you took it." Margaret almost laughed, but not because anything was funny. "A silver locket? And you thought I'd be carrying it around in my pocket for 3 weeks while I scrubbed floors and cooked meals? That would be pretty foolish for someone you think is a clever thief." Daniel stepped down from the porch and moved to stand beside her. She could feel his warmth and strength, and it made her feel braver. "Seems to me that Mrs. Pemberton might want to look closer to home for her missing jewelry. I hear her nephew Billy's been losing money at poker every night this week." The words hit their target like an arrow hitting the center of a bullseye. Margaret saw understanding flash across Pete's face, followed by embarrassment. Even Hollister looked like he was starting to doubt himself. "Billy Pemberton?" Pete said slowly. "That boy's been gambling away everything he can get his hands on. Lost his horse last Tuesday, and his watch the night before that." "Shut up, Pete," Hollister snapped. But his anger seemed forced now, like he was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away from him. Margaret saw her chance and took it. Mrs. Pemberton didn't want to believe her own nephew was a thief, so she blamed the outsider instead, the one who looked different and had no one to defend her. "That's enough," Daniel said quietly, but his words carried power. "You've seen everything Miss Chen owns. You've heard the truth about Billy Pemberton. Now it's time for you to leave my land." Hollister looked around at his friends, seeing doubt in their faces. The certainty that had brought them up the mountain was cracking like ice in spring. "This ain't over," he muttered, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," Daniel said, and Margaret heard steel in his voice. "If any of you set foot on my property again, if anyone in town spreads lies about Miss Chen, if she faces even one harsh word because of today." He didn't finish the threat, but the meaning was clear as mountain air. The 4 men climbed back onto their horses without saying another word. But as they prepared to ride away, Hollister couldn't resist one last cruel comment. "You're a fool to trust her kind, Morrison. People like her will stab you in the back, first chance they get." The words stung Margaret like a wasp, but before she could respond, Daniel's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "People like her?" he said, his tone dangerously quiet. "You mean people who work hard, tell the truth, and face their accusers with courage? People who stand up for what's right, even when they're outnumbered and afraid? If those are the kind of people Margaret Chen represents, then I'm proud to stand with her." Hollister's face turned red as a sunset, but he had no answer for Daniel's words. With a curse, he spurred his horse forward, and the 4 men rode away down the mountain trail, leaving tracks in the snow that would melt away with the next storm. Margaret and Daniel stood together in the sudden quiet, watching the riders disappear between the trees. The danger was over, but Margaret felt shaky now that the fear was leaving her body. Her hands trembled as she put her few belongings back in her pockets. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Defend me like that. It would have been easier to let them search the cabin and send me away afterward." Daniel looked at her with eyes that were kind but serious. "Maybe easier, but not right. And I've learned that doing what's easy and doing what's right aren't always the same thing." The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and making the snow on the cabin roof start to melt in tiny streams. Margaret felt something changing inside her, like a frozen stream beginning to flow again after a long winter. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her, not because they felt sorry for her, but because they believed she deserved it. The silver locket glinted in Pete's trembling hand, like a guilty secret finally brought to light. "Found this in my saddlebag this morning," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper as he held up the jewelry. My nephew must have put it there when he borrowed my horse yesterday." The admission hung in the cold air like smoke from a dying fire. Hollister's face turned the color of fresh blood. "You lying snake. You said you didn't know nothing about no locket." "I didn't. Not until this morning when I was checking my gear." Pete's horse danced nervously beneath him, sensing his rider's fear. "Tommy's been in trouble before. Gambling debts. I should have known when he asked to borrow my horse so sudden-like." Margaret felt her knees go weak with relief, but she forced herself to stand straight. 3 weeks of fear and worry crashed down on her shoulders all at once. She had spent countless nights wondering if someone would come for her, if she would have to run again into the bitter cold. "So the thief ain't the Chinese girl," said another rider, a younger man with kind eyes. "It's your own blood, Pete." The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the horse's legs. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and watched as the truth settled over the group like a heavy blanket. She could see shame creeping across Pete's weathered face. "I'm sorry," Pete said, looking directly at Margaret. "I'm real sorry, miss. Tommy, he's had troubles since he came back from the war. Lost his mind somewhere in those battles. But that don't excuse what we done here today." Daniel stepped forward, his rifle still ready but no longer aimed. "Apologies don't erase the harm of false accusations, Pete. Your nephew stole that locket, and you all came here ready to blame an innocent woman." Hollister spat in the snow, his anger now focused on his companion. "This don't change nothing. She's still not one of us. Still don't belong here. Neither did my Irish grandfather," Daniel replied calmly. "Neither did the German families who settled down valley. Neither did half the folks in this territory, if you want to get particular about it." Margaret watched the exchange with growing amazement. She had never seen anyone defend her like this. Never had someone stand up to angry men on her behalf. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear now, but with something warmer and stronger. The youngest rider, barely old enough to shave, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe we should head back to town. Talk to Tommy. Sort this whole mess out proper-like." "Smart boy," Daniel said, nodding at the young man. "Wish his elders had half his sense." Hollister's face twisted with rage. "This ain't over, Morrison. You can protect her today, but what happens when you're not around? What happens when you go to town for supplies? Or head down to the valley for work?" The threat in his words made Margaret's blood run cold. She realized that even with the truth revealed, even with the real thief identified, some people would never accept her. Some hearts were too closed, too full of hatred, to let in any light. "What happens," Daniel said quietly, "is that I'll make sure the whole territory knows what kind of men make threats against innocent women. And I'll make sure they know what happens to such men when they act on those threats." Pete cleared his throat nervously. "Jake, we should go. The girl didn't steal nothing. We got no business here." "Listen to Pete," the young rider added. "We done enough damage for one day." Hollister looked around at his companions, seeing his support crumbling like old wood in a fire. Finally, he jerked his horse's reins hard enough to make the animal toss its head. "This territory's changing," he snarled. "Used to be a place for real Americans." "It's changing for the better," Daniel replied. "Now get off my land before I decide to speed up that change." The riders turned their horses and began to move away, but Margaret could feel Hollister's hateful stare burning into her back. She knew this wouldn't be the end. Men like him didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. As the sound of hoofbeats faded down the mountain, Margaret felt her legs give out. She sank down onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. All the strength she had summoned to face the men drained away like water from a broken bucket. Daniel sat down beside her, setting his rifle against the cabin wall. "You did good out there," he said softly. "Took real courage to face them down like that." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted, her voice shaking. "Being scared don't mean you ain't brave. Sometimes it means the opposite." They sat in silence for a while, watching the snow fall. Margaret's mind was spinning with everything that had happened. The false accusation, the confrontation, the truth finally coming out. It all felt like a strange dream. "Daniel," she said finally, "Hollister was right about one thing. What happens when you're not here to protect me? I can't hide behind you forever." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "You won't have to. This is your home now, Margaret. Not just a place you work, but your actual home. And anybody who has a problem with that will have to deal with both of us." The words sent a warm feeling through her chest, like drinking hot soup on a cold day. Home. She had almost forgotten what that word meant. But what if more trouble comes? What if Hollister brings others? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, thinking, "Then we'll face it together. But Margaret, I want you to learn to defend yourself too. Not just rely on me. A woman should know how to protect herself, especially out here." "You mean fighting?" "I mean shooting, riding, knowing the land well enough to disappear into it if you need to. This is wild country, and it don't care if you're a man or woman, white or Chinese or anything else. It only cares if you're strong enough to survive." Margaret nodded slowly. The idea frightened her, but it also excited her. She had spent her whole life trying to be small, quiet, invisible. Maybe it was time to learn to be something else. "Will you teach me?" "Starting tomorrow," Daniel promised. "But tonight, let's just be grateful we're both safe." As they walked back into the cabin, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The scared, desperate woman who had knocked on Daniel's door was still there, but she was changing, growing stronger, learning that she didn't have to face the world alone. 6 months later, Margaret could hit a tin can from 50 yards with Daniel's old pistol, and she no longer jumped at every sound in the forest. Spring had transformed the Montana Territory into a green paradise, with wildflowers blooming in meadows that had been buried under snow just weeks before. Margaret had learned to read the sky for weather, to track animals through the forest, and to find her way home even in the thickest fog. But more importantly, she had learned to read Daniel. She could tell by the set of his shoulders when he was worried about something. She knew he liked his coffee strong in the morning and weak in the evening. She had discovered that he read poetry when he couldn't sleep, and that he sometimes talked to his horses like they were people. And she had begun to suspect that his feelings for her had grown beyond simple friendship. The realization had crept up on her slowly, like sunrise creeping over the mountains. It started with little things. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. How he always made sure she got the choice pieces of meat at dinner. The gentle way he corrected her when she was learning to shoot. "You're pulling the trigger too fast," he said one morning as they practiced behind the cabin. "Shooting ain't about being quick. It's about being calm." He stepped behind her, his hands covering hers on the pistol. Margaret's heart started beating so fast she was sure he could hear it. "Feel how I'm breathing?" he said quietly, his chest against her back. "Slow and steady. Let your body relax. The gun should feel like part of your hand." Margaret tried to focus on the target, but all she could think about was how warm Daniel felt behind her, how safe she felt in the circle of his arm. When she finally pulled the trigger, the shot went wild, missing the tin can by a foot. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping away quickly. "I can't concentrate." Daniel studied her face for a moment, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. "Maybe we should take a break." They walked back to the cabin in uncomfortable silence. Margaret's mind was racing. She had feelings for Daniel, deep, complicated feelings that scared her more than facing down Hollister and his men. But what if she was wrong about his feelings? What if she was just reading too much into his kindness? That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Daniel seemed unusually quiet. He kept starting to say something, then stopping himself. Finally, Margaret couldn't stand it anymore. "Daniel, is something wrong?" He looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Her heart started pounding again. "All right. Are you happy here? I mean, really happy? Not just safe and fed, but actually happy?" The question surprised her. "Of course I'm happy. Why would you ask that?" "Because I've been thinking." He set his book aside and leaned forward. "When you first came here, you were running from something, looking for work, for shelter. But you got your strength back now. You can take care of yourself. You could go anywhere, do anything." Margaret felt a cold fear creeping into her chest. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." The word came out so fast and loud that it startled them both. "No, Margaret. That's not what I'm asking at all." He stood up and began pacing in front of the fireplace, running his hands through his hair. What I'm trying to ask is." He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "I'm asking if you want to stay. Not because you have to. Not because you got nowhere else to go, but because you want to. Because this place, this life, because I matter to you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. This was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. "Daniel," she said softly, standing up to face him. "6 months ago, I came to your door with nothing. No money, no family, no hope. I thought my worth was measured by how useful I could be, how little trouble I could cause." He started to speak, but she held up her hand. "You changed all that. You didn't just give me work, you gave me dignity. You didn't just give me shelter, you gave me a home. And you didn't just save my life, you taught me that my life was worth saving." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in his eyes. "So yes, I want to stay. Not because I have to, but because I can't imagine being anywhere else. Because somewhere along the way, taking care of your house became taking care of our home. And taking care of you became," she paused, gathering her courage, "became loving you." The smile that spread across Daniel's face was like watching the sun come up. "Margaret Chen," he said, reaching for her hands. "I have been half in love with you since the day you stepped out from behind those trees to face down 4 angry men. And I've been completely in love with you since the day I realized you weren't just brave, you were home." When he kissed her, Margaret felt something settle into place inside her chest, like the last piece of a puzzle finding its proper spot. She had spent her whole life being told she didn't belong anywhere. But here, in Daniel's arms, in their cabin, on their mountain, she finally understood what belonging felt like. Outside, the spring wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the promise of summer. Inside, 2 people who had found each other against all odds held each other close and planned a future filled with all the things Margaret had never dared to dream of: love, security, and the deep satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Later that night, as they sat together planning their wedding, Margaret thought about the terrified woman who had whispered her worth to the winter wind 6 months ago. That woman had believed she was only valuable for what she could do for others. This woman, the one who had learned to shoot, to ride, to stand her ground, knew better. She was valuable simply because she existed. She deserved love, respect, and happiness, not because she had earned them, but because she was human. And she deserved to take up space in the world. Not just the small, quiet corners she had always hidden in, but the wide, beautiful spaces where people built lives and loved each other, and created something meaningful together. The girl who had whispered, "I can cook, I can clean, I can be quiet," had found a man who opened not just his door, but his heart. And in doing so, she had discovered that her true worth wasn't in making herself small. It was in allowing herself to grow into all the magnificent things she was meant to be.